memorable. There's still a bit of space, but not too much. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Professor Tom Stonier, Professor of Science and Society at the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. Professor Stonier wears two hats these days. His first is as an academic in the aforementioned university department, where his department is interested in the relationship between science, technology and society. In this role, I guess he is also the author of a recent book published by Thames Methuen, The Wealth of Information, and I have a copy here. Professor Stonier asked me to tell you that most of the material he'll be talking about is actually in this book. With another hat, he is chairman of Ask, the largest educational software company in the United Kingdom. Professor Stonier was a keynote speaker at 9ACC in Hobart last year, and it is a measure of the power of his message that he has been invited back to 10ACC. Yesterday he was a speaker at the Technology Summit, and if you'd like to buy this morning's Age, you'll see that speech was widely reported on page 1. The format of today's session is that Professor Stonier will talk for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will follow this with questions. The title of Professor Stonier's address is Computer Information Technology and its Impact on Western Society. Professor Stonier.
Thank you, Tony. I didn't realize that I would be in a position to address you on what seems to become a national holiday. And as you're token American, I can only say congratulations to you all. I know you work very hard, every one of you in this audience. I'm going to try to cover a lot of information. You know that 40 minutes or whatever is allotted brief span of time that I'm allotted on this planet. I want to cover it, therefore, in a very superficial manner, but I hope that during the question period, where I have achieved a credibility gap, you will challenge me and allow me either to clarify or retract if it turns out to be necessary to do so. Now, I want to cover the impact of the essentially information technology, but let's face it, when we talk about information technology these days, we're not talking about books anymore, although that was a key bit of information technology. What we're talking about now is electronic information technology, which is unique in human history insofar as it not only allows you to store information, but to process information. And one of the great debates that I think is going to start up, or has started up, sort of a philosophical debate, and I think I will address myself to that question more tomorrow, is the question of, do computers think, and what are they doing when they're processing data? What I want to do today is look at the following topics: shifting employment patterns, impact on education, impact on the home, impact on organizations, global society, and impact on thought patterns, which will be mainly tomorrow's. All right? So take a deep breath, and here we go. Now, the computer constitutes what I call a meta-technology. That is to say, a sort of a super technology which affects large areas of existing technology. The classic example of a meta-technology is the steam engine. Now, initially, the steam engine was invented for pumping water out of mines. And it was a dedicated machine that was used for that specific purpose for about half a century, until it became sufficiently perfected and there was enough experience to begin to understand that it was in fact not a water pumping machine at all, but an energy machine, an energy device, which could be coupled to other mechanical devices. And what we generally think of as the early industrial revolution was in fact the spread of that meta-technology. For example, if you coupled the steam engine to a wagon on rails, you had a locomotive. If you coupled the steam engine to a loom, you had a power loom. And as I said, that period, late 18th, early 19th century, that we historically consider as the Industrial Revolution, was the spread of that meta-technology. Well, today's meta-technology is a computer. You couple a computer to a lathe, you've got a numerically controlled lathe. You couple it to a typewriter, you've got a word processor. You couple it to a money counting machine, you've got an automatic teller. You couple it to a time counting machine, you've got a digital wristwatch. You couple it to a television set and run it through a Prestel, a view data type system. You now set the stage for doing the jobs of many middle class professions, estate agents, travel agents. And as this technology begins to hit, it will rapidly change employment in all areas. Now, it is no longer in 1983 to say to people, watch what happens to employment in the manufacturing sector. But I like to sum up what's happening in the manufacturing sector by the following two sentences. Those enterprises which do not automate are going to go out of business. And those that do are not going to provide jobs. All right? It's a very simple equation. Either you automate and you develop, you utilize the latest technology, and if you do, you will be increasingly productive, and that means you don't need people. In the north of England, there is a factory under construction or in advanced planning stage. Turn out a lot of textiles. Plans call for two kinds of people. A very small number, a handful of engineers in white lab coats to maintain and modify robotized systems, and security personnel. That's the only two kind of people you need in a modern factory. Right? You need people in the offices. You need salesmen. You need marketing analysts. But in the factory, you don't need any more than that. Now, that sort of thing is beginning to be understood widely throughout the Western world. What isn't fully understood yet is the same process is now going to hit much of the, shall we say, lower level information area, in particular the offices. Now, I mentioned the automatic teller machines. Well, one bank I have had dealings with already 2 years ago cited the figure that for every 100 automatic teller machines they install, they will need 80 fewer bank tellers. The trade unions in Europe are saying that during the 1980s, 40% of the jobs in banking will be lost. I've heard, and I haven't been able to corroborate this, but it sounds reasonable, that the banks in Britain in 1980 took on 40,000 trainees. In 1981, 6,000. In 1982, 6,000. This year, about the same. And it's not because banking is in a recession. Banking has been doing very nicely, thank you. The problem is they don't need people anymore, or by far fewer people. Insurance, well, increasingly the processes get automated, and it's interesting how it comes into smaller and smaller concerns. We do business with a small agency which is run by two partners who in bad times employ 2 girls and in good times employ 4 girls. Times have been bad, so they've been employing 2 girls. Times are getting better, but this time, instead of hiring an additional 2 girls, they're buying a computer. Now, it's not that they don't like hiring girls, it's simply that the computer is much, much more cost effective and allows them to do things they couldn't do before. That paradigm of a small company not firing anybody except during bad times but not rehiring when times get better because they're shifting to technology. That's a paradigm for what's happening throughout much of Western society. You see, there are 2 girls coming on stream now in the next year or 2 who are not getting jobs. And one reason one gets this very large bulge of unemployed youth is because that's the process. You see, it's almost never that old Charlie gets fired when a robot is brought in, or Mary's let go when a word processor comes in. It's when Charlie retires that he's not replaced. When Mary goes off for another job or to have a baby or whatever, she's not replaced. And who are these former employees not replaced with? The young people. And it is that why the young coming on stream. Now here in Australia, you're well up into the 15 to 20% unemployment among young people. And let me warn you, there is no way a society can have a large number of young people with no economic stake in society without society fraying at the edges and potentially falling apart. It is, without a doubt, the outstanding problem confronting Western societies. By the way, it is not confined to Western societies, and the technology is not always a computer. Just parenthetically, in the third world, the job killer is not the computer, it's a tractor. Because what's happening on the farms there now. And you've got to understand too, it's a third world, and I'll get back to that, which is moving from an agrarian into an industrial era, whereas we're moving from an industrial to post-industrial or information era. Well, that's one area, and I just briefly, perhaps before leaving it, would like to state what I think must be the response. And the response goes something like this. First of all, a recognition that from here on in, there is no further correlation between material wealth production and jobs, any more than there is a correlation between food production and jobs, which would have been a very strange statement to make 300 years ago when 90% of the labor force was employed I'm talking in Europe, of course. 90% of the labor force worked on farms. And the idea that you would reach a period, as we have now, where in a post-industrial economy it takes no more than 2% of the labor force to feed a society. I mean, Australia, you've clearly got about 4, maybe almost 5 times that number, but remember, you're a major exporter of food. In the US, it's about 2.5%. It is also a major exporter of food, but you need really no more than 2% of the workforce on farms. Well, that would have seemed very strange long ago. We accept it, and I don't hear a lot of, people say, let's make jobs on farms, right? But the jobs aren't going to be in the manufacturing sector, and the jobs aren't going to be in many traditional areas of commerce. That is to say, I mentioned banking and insurance, but it's true for wholesaling, retailing, it's true for finance in general, it's true for offices, including government offices. The answer is, in my view, a massive expansion of public service sector employment, in particular in the areas of education and health. Those continue to be labor-intensive industries, even though, as I will mention, there is a revolution in education breeding. Now, I don't want to belabor it other than saying the jobs of the future will be nurses and teachers. They will not be farmers and automobile mechanics or miners or even construction workers. All right? The jobs of the future will be in those service sector. And there is no question in my mind that there is no way the private sector is going to pick up the number of unemployed that are going to be generated as this technology continues to bite. Before leaving the subject, I would like to point out how one pays for this. And that involves 2 kinds of arguments, which I don't want to go into great detail, but let me just give you the very brief bones of it. The first is, in addition to the governments of post-industrial economies expanding employment in the public service sector, the governments must work very hard to get the private sector to generate more wealth. In other words, the private sector in the future is not to be a provider of employment, but a provider of wealth which generates revenue in order to pay for the expansion of employment in the public sector. Now, that sort of thing happens almost willy-nilly. in Britain, the UK government is receiving about £8,000 million this year for doing nothing other than being lucky enough to have jurisdiction over pieces of North Sea which are yielding oil. Now that is a private sector enterprise largely. It is yielding enormous revenue for the government. In fact, the government, if it's thought its way clear to do so, could spend that money to double the education budget in a stroke, just about solve its unemployment problem. And that, by the way, is a second argument. I would begin in Australia. If one looks at the figure, you have about, and I must admit these are based on 1980 figure, you have about 300,000 unemployed. You also have about 300,000 people working in the education field. If you were to increase your $6 billion or so budget to $9 billion, you would create at least another 150,000 jobs. And if you made an attractive system that kept, let's say, doubled the number of people going into the tertiary system, you would probably keep another 150,000 directly, indirectly off the dole, which is costing you, the taxpayer, $1 billion annually in direct payment, and probably another $1.5 billion in administrative costs and lost revenue. So by investing $3 billion, you would probably be saving $2 to $2.5 billion. And of course, what you would be achieving is upgrading, as it were, the Australian human database. Which leads me to the next point, which is the most important single resource of a post-industrial society, is the skills and information. It is what people have in their heads, because it's people who invent new things or design new things, like keels. People, people who create the wealth. Right? It's people who get things organized. It's people who constitute a country's most valuable resource. And it is the real weakness, in my view, of Australia going into the information society is its lack of education. And it came out at yesterday's Science Summit Conference. And I will make a statement I made there. An educated workforce learns how to exploit new technology. An ignorant one becomes its victim. I'm going to repeat that because that applies even more to managers than it does to the boffin on the shop floor. An educated workforce learns how to exploit new technology, and an ignorant one becomes its victim. Right? Now, one of the things that's misunderstood about education, you think, what do we need PhDs for to run, I don't know, whatever it is. The truth is, with education, you don't need it 90% of the time. You may not even need it 99% of the time. But that 1% of the time, when you know something that somebody else doesn't, you understand something that somebody else doesn't, that's where the breakthrough is. All right? And you never know exactly where it is. And one of the great problems for Western society is enormous number of decisions are being made by technological illiterates, and at the same time, and I would accuse the computer community of that as well, we've created these trained professionals who've got blinkers, and they don't understand the human dimensions, they don't understand the environment, they don't understand politics. Their relationship to politicians is to denigrate them, when in fact they are the people who could be helping them. And when somebody does, and I heard this recently on 2 occasions involving 2 different ministers, one of whom is known to you and one of them is in another country, where he said, oh, well, he talks a good game, but he doesn't do anything. Well, I said, he cannot move until you create the public opinion which allows him to move. And that's one of the things. And I think an organization like the Australian Computer Society must take the lead in many areas in helping the government develop new legislation. And it can be something very specific, like, what is the situation of copyright laws vis-a-vis software? Happens to be a thing of great interest to me. It's about as fuzzy as you can get. I mean, virtually all the laws, you know, some of them have caught up to the big machines of the early 60s. Some are, you know, not even that far. Okay, impact on education. I'm not going to dwell on that very long. I'm doing that for the school symposium on Friday. But I will say this. The first genuine revolution in about a century is starting. It will hit very hard in the 80s. And the nature of that is the home computer. 100 years ago, Victorian forefathers went to mass education, and it swept around the world. And that was a great revolution, because before that, education was only for the elite. But today's classroom is merely an extension of the Victorian classroom. It's true, you keep kids in longer, and you teach them a lot more than reading and writing, and you don't hit them so much anymore and whatever. But basically, it's the same thing. And there's an awful lot of that sort of Victorian prudery, the old adage, doesn't matter what you teach them as long as they don't like it, but what is going to shape up now is home computers. And the reason, can I have a survey, please? I mean, here we are. Can I have a show of hands? How many people have a home computer? Can I have a show of hands, please? That's pretty good. I would estimate that's probably 20%. Needless to say, all of you, virtually all of you, will have it by the time the 80s are finished. I would say in your case within 5 years. I always like to pull in, which is, you'll forgive me, but if I have a skeptical audience, I always say, okay, would you believe me? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. But I usually convince the skeptics by saying, okay, how many people here have a pocket calculator? All right? And virtually every hand goes up. And I won't ask you, because I'm sure virtually every hand will go up. But that technology moved incredibly fast in 10 years. Now, pocket calculator is cost effective because it got so cheap. And to tell you the truth, a home computer isn't. Firstly, it's more expensive here than it is in the US and in Europe, but there isn't that much you can do with a home computer yet, except learn about computing. This idea of you can put recipes on it. The trouble is, the recipes are really better on 3x5 card, because you can have them in the kitchen. In this business, how many eggs can you run into the living room to look at it? So, what we... I'm running out of time. In fact, I'm suddenly into the home. But what I'm trying to tell you is, and this is, I think I know whereof I speak from personal experience, over the next 2 years, watch a flood of good education software appear. Because there are several large professional organizations, and I like to think mine included, which has got a very good team of educators, programmers, graphics designers, who are beginning to develop not only, shall we say, educationally sound, or well-programmed, but also educationally sound software. And what is shaping up is, within 5 years, the average 4-year-old will know how to read. Children will learn to read about as fast as they'll learn to talk. And I would also make the forecast that once these systems get fully established and we start having a mix of school and home-based system, and I'll be happy to describe that further in the discussion, I would say the vast majority, vast bulk of 12-year-olds by the turn of the century will understand calculus. The power of the computer is so great, it is the most important pedagogic device in human history since the invention of speech. Okay, impact on the home. Well, computers will not only run the environmental systems of the home. When a computer costs you hundreds of thousands of millions of pounds, you got to be very careful when you use them. When a chip retails for less than $1, you can put in a light switch. And that is in fact what's happening. So you walk in the room, the lights go on, and you walk out, and after a little while it shuts off, and you'll have a variety of microwave ovens and things that'll turn on the roast at 4:30 and the potatoes at 6 o'clock, and I don't know, whatever it is, and it'll keep it warm for you in case you've been delayed at the office. But of course there may be a second thing. You may not be at the office in any case, you may be home. Because one of the things that's going to happen increasingly is the home as a workstation. I mean, if you're going to get computers that you can talk to, remember Logica this year came out, in England, came out with a system that's really quite a good voice-to-print device. It's a mini computer running around 20,000 pounds, but that means 10 years from now, it'll run at about a tenth that, and it'll probably be a lot better. I mean, you can talk to it in a Welsh accent or even a New Yorkshire accent, if that's what you're wondering, what I've got, transatlantic one. And I don't know whether that's the ominous sign as the technology is about to blow up. I'm always a little worried about that sort of thing. It's like when you're talking and suddenly you're getting the voice back and you don't know whether it's you or somebody else. And anyway, the home, the major change in the home is the next great consumer boom is home electronic information and communication devices. Right? The average middle-class family 10 years from now is expected to spend about as much on those devices as on the family car. And they'll range not only on a computer and, stuff to tie you into telephone lines, maybe even optical fibers, and in some instances, certainly a dish on the roof, printers, cheap video discs, which incidentally, going back into the computer as a learning device, it means, remember, the laser video disc can store gigabytes and 55,000 individual frames, which means at 15 frames per second you can run a film for an hour. It means you can access immediately. You want to study a Shakespeare play, or you want illustration, biology, or chemistry. The power is going to be enormous. So the home will become again a center of education and increasingly a workstation. If you can talk to us out and correct all your spelling mistakes, there's no reason why I can't go down the telephone line to the office. And in fact, a very interesting thing happened this past year in England with Rank Xerox. They decided they had too many offices and things scattered around the south of England. They consolidated them in one office in London and found they didn't have the space. And here's what they did. They took a number of their DP people and others and fired them. But then they rehired them as consultants on a three-day basis, giving them as much money, as much take-home pay as they were getting before. And they also, I think, covered the pension plan. But everybody's happy because, and they provide them with a terminal at home. So for 3 days a week, they were employed at a salary that they used to have 5 days. So the extra 2 days they could either lounge around, or they could say, look, I'm a consultant to Xerox, why, they became consultants for this. So they actually improved their income. The company was very happy because all kinds of overhead costs were no longer a problem. Now, this could well be the sort of model of what will happen increasingly. Right? So in any case, the name of the game is distributive systems, and that's going to be increasingly true for people. And that leads me to another thing, impact on organizations. We're going to have the steep hierarchies where the boss communicates with a guy here and with B and C and so forth, and A doesn't know what B's doing without going to the boss, and so that's all breaking down. We're now dealing with networks of people, and depending what the problem is, various experts come to the top. The original hierarchies are going to get very flat. We're going to have teams which sort of, the old Iroquois had a system where there was the elders were the chiefs, and their word was law during peacetime, and in wartime there would emerge a younger warrior who would lead, and his word was law. And then when he went back to peacetime, he was just another guy, and so forth. So I'm using that as a kind of a model for what will happen increasingly. And large organizations that don't follow this are going to be, organizational dinosaurs are going to phase out. Because there's no way, I think, you can keep the creativity and the maximum value of the human capital that you've got, which after all is the most important thing you've got. And if you haven't got that, I don't care what the physical assets are, you'll go down the drain. So I see that sort of change in organization. And that, somewhat similar, these changing flows of information and changing levels of sophistication is what's happening in all Western societies that have moved into what I call a communicative era, the information era if you wish. And it overtook the southern tier European states in the 1970s, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and that process, in my view, will overtake the Soviet Union in the 80s, certainly by the mid-90s. And that means the Soviet Union is undergoing profound institutional political change, and I view the Soviet Union as democratizing in clearly perceptible terms, probably before the end of this decade, certainly by the mid-90s. That is to say, the process is going much faster than people are aware of. And again, because I'm limiting myself to another 3 minutes, I'll take it up in the discussion. Someone might like to ask for some of the evidence. And the last thing in this global society area is this. The primary motivation for war has always been the extension of resources. If you had a growing population, in the old days there was only one way to get growing resources, and that was to take away somebody else's. The primary motivation for war was always the extension of resources. There were secondary motives like defense and revenge and status and so forth, and often it was couched ideologically, like the Crusades in Europe, but that's the primary motivation was the extension of resources to solve your population problem. Today, it is much more cost-effective to double yield per acre, which you can do technologically, than to try to double your acreage by taking away somebody else's. And that is why the institution of war is rapidly declining in that sector of the world which is technologically advanced. In other words, in that sector of the world that's moving, or has moved, out of the industrial into the post-industrial information economy. The third world, may I just remind you, is moving into the industrial world, and there we see more authoritarianism, more militarism, more nationalism, more strife, internal and external. And the great problem confronting global societies is to help the third world countries to move out of or through this rather sordid industrial period and into a high productivity, politically stable, and much more just and pleasant society. And we must not lose sight of that. And I see things getting worse in the 80s, but once the Soviet Union shows clear signs of democratizing, one of the first things they will do is to normalize relations with the West. And that means an end to the Cold War. And that means an unleashing of enormous financial, managerial, and scientific energies, which can, in fact, be devoted to helping the third world. And lastly, this, of course, is the computer telling me I've run out of time. I've overridden. I just want to make one more point. I always tell the stupid joke about Casio coming out with a new model next year, which has a built-in laser which vaporizes a speaker after 30 seconds. Anyway, the last thing that I just want to open up. We have created machines that are able to do things that formerly we could only do inside of our heads. And they do some of these things extremely well, right? I mean, I defy anybody here to come up with a square root of whatever I punch in, a 4-digit number with a speed this does. And we have now, as we get these home computers and as they become familiar, we'll have a generation of children growing up with this experience. It's bound to have an impact on civilization. I don't know quite what that impact is, but it certainly will be fun to watch. Anyway, thank you. The problem is parallel to having children learn at home. I didn't have a chance to amplify on this. And I'll begin with schools because I'll get back to the other. Children have to play with other children. Children have to engage in sports. School, therefore, will, for younger children, have an increasingly different function. They will learn how to read and write at home. They will learn arithmetic. They will introduction to biology. School is where they go to play, learn social skills. They'll go on field trips. They'll work with more dangerous machinery or experiments and so forth. Which, by the way, the first implication of that is that in the future, for children, home is a place you go to learn, school is a place you go to play. And that'll be on. For older children now, teachers at the secondary level, for example, will find the flows of information change. Now that has already happened up and down the world. I hear stories of computers in schools and the teachers all admitting that the kids know more about it than they do, and that the teachers learn from the kids. And I've seen this on a number of occasions. Now, what happens here is that the teachers in the future are going to have to become what I call knowledge counselors or information guides. And the relationship between teachers and pupils will be jointly exploring knowledge the way a professor does with his postgraduate students or sometimes with his undergraduate students. I should tell you that 80% of what I know about computers I learned from my undergraduate students. So it's that sort of thing. When it comes to work, for businessmen, the most important function is going to be lunches. Now, we all know that most serious transactions in this world, most business deals get closed over lunch, or occasionally, if it's important enough, over dinner. Now, I have a theory which says that food sharing is a very basic hominid instinct. You see, it's unknown among primates, or virtually unknown. There are minor exceptions, very minor. The hominids are the only ones that extensively engage in food sharing. I feel it sort of creates a psychological atmosphere of trust, which you need. You can't conduct business if you don't trust the other's party. So that's going to be one. There's going to be another thing. The isolation at home that you ask for, on the one hand, it won't be quite as isolated because you will have the family there. In other words, the children will be there some of the time and so forth. But of course, for some of us, that merely implies screaming mimes because it's, and there'll be no question that people will go out to work in part simply for social functions. And one of the very important aspects, and why being unemployed is such a psychological disaster, is because you miss your workmates, you miss the routine. But something I haven't touched on, when I talk to trade unions, for example, I suggest that they put pressure on national governments to negotiate international agreements, like GATT agreements, to reduce the work week by 5% every 10 years. That would mean the work week would be cut in half in a 30 to 35 year period. And so what I'm expecting is a much nicer mix. And one final point, and I hope you get used to my short answers because that's just the way things go, and that is the future lifestyles, the divisions that are very sharp now between paid employment, leisure, and education will become totally blurred because we keep moving in and out of one or the other, and it's going to be very hard to tell. Like I like to think right now, many of you are here professionally. Therefore, is it part of paid employment, or shouldn't it be? Certainly, it should be part of education, and I like to think it's entertaining, so maybe it's part of leisure as well.
Yes, your one credibility gap, I think, is that you seem to be totally ignoring the software problem. And a programmer producing 10 lines a day is a common rate of productivity. It's an incredibly labor-intensive process. And we have a foreseeable need now of several tens of millions of lines of code. I'd suggest to you that a computer is like a motorway. A motorway moves a traffic jam from one place to another. I'd suggest a computer moves a problem from anywhere into software. And would you like to comment?
Being a founder and a president of a software house, I know there are problems, and some extremely frustrating because we're producing some of these education programs I mentioned, and the incredible frustration of you've produced this work of art, for one machine, and you'd love it to work on another machine, but of course you've got to start all over again because of incompatibility. And the crowning blow for us was when we had produced it for a machine in Britain, and thought, well, we'll use it, in America, which after all everybody wants to get into the American market, and discovered to our horror that although the machine was happy to read what we're doing, the television sets in America, of course, are different from the television sets in the UK, and since our stuff is all largely graphic, we had to start from scratch. But what happens all along is people get more experience and get better. Increasingly, the development of high-level languages allows certain kinds of software to be done easier. And what is also shaping up on the horizon is increasingly hardware solutions for software problems. And so I think right now that is the bottleneck. It's a little bit as if the automobile has come on. We haven't got the freeways and the highways yet. We're still on the old road. And in some cases, remember the laws where the man had to walk 10 paces in front with a red flag or something, so they couldn't frighten horses. We're still just coming out of that era.
I'm Elias Awad. I'm from the less popular U.S. sector today. I can appreciate what you were saying about the ratio of ATMs to tellers, but I'd like to share with you maybe some observations based on what we're doing in the United States, essentially states of Florida and Indiana. There's been, as you know, in the 60s, we installed computers to displace labor and cut down the cost of production or producing information. In the 70s and today, we install computers simply to improve the bottom line, the productivity, in other words, improve the profitability of the firm. And in the banking sector, we've had cases where the number one issue in banking, at least in the United States, if I happen to represent a couple of banks, one of them I'm on their board of directors, that if you're going to be a service bank, all service bank, you have to have tellers all over. Not so much to do the same as the ATMs are doing, although those banks will have ATMs, but I think we have enriched their jobs in terms of making them, getting them involved in business development, for example, rather than simply receiving and cashing, transactions that now ATMs can do. And also, to what extent I think ATMs or technology, electronic information age, can contribute to the bottom line, so to speak, has a lot to do with the industry. For example, if you visit any of the supermarkets in the United States, where you have barcode entry, where they pass them through those scanners, all the clerk has to do to get a job is to pass a hearing test, because all the programming has been done through the system.
Right, but how many people do you need in the supermarkets with the barcodes?
You still need the same number of people to represent the same number of stations.
No.
All it's doing, improving the flow based on a couple of studies I happen to know, one at the University of Michigan. It did improve the flow, which expedited people when they go shopping. The thing that they hate most is to have to wait in line to get out.
Sure.
And when you have ice cream and other details, get melted and so on, they want to get out, get in the car and go home. And I think this is where the people factor continues to be important. And also what's trendy in the United States, that organizations are awakening to their social responsibility to the community. So it's becoming more and more difficult, especially like during recession, for businesses to go ahead and cut their staff down in half without really thinking twice. So I tend to think that perhaps the technology tends to make us more conscious of the need to maintain people rather than to reduce people, other factors considered. Obviously, there's always room for cutting down. Thank you.
Okay. All I can say is that doesn't jibe with the studies we've had. And it's, as I said, it's almost never when you introduce new technology in a company. Firstly, most new technologies introduced not to reduce labor costs, but simply because it allows you to do things better. And incidentally, the barcodes is an example, to improve that flow. And I recently, last week, there was a study in New Zealand of a supermarket which did it very properly. It consulted with the unions, didn't fire anybody, they redeployed the extra people, they improved the service, and they improved the number of customers. There, what more could you want? But where were those customers not going that now closed up?
Derek Spear, I'm from Manukau Technical Institute in New Zealand. I think the situation is very similar in Australia and New Zealand as far as the point I'm making. You mentioned the possibility of expanding the tertiary education sector and mopping up effectively the large numbers of unemployed youth into the tertiary education section. Firstly, I can immediately see that all that's going to do is postpone the crisis for 3 or 4 years until they're coming out the other end of the sausage machine. And the second point about this is that, as a sweeping generalisation, the top 20% of school leavers are going into the tertiary education, the middle 60% are going into employment, and the unskilled lowest 20% are the people who are going onto the dole. And my feeling is that most of these people are not educationally qualified or perhaps intellectually qualified to ever be accepted by any tertiary education institution, and currently they're probably virtually unemployable. The jobs for them have been eliminated, as you yourself have pointed out. So just wonder if you could elaborate on those points.
Yeah, sure. Very good. First, let me point out that the figures that I gave for Australia, and I am sure they're applicable for New Zealand and many other countries, not the specific figures, but the overall principle. What I suggested was that the $3 billion would create 150,000 jobs. I mean, that's jobs. And I would, reduce the number of teachers, reduce the classroom size, so increase the number of teachers there. You don't give them an increase in pay, but you reduce the number of people responsible for it, and I feel increase their productivity, and that's important to keep in mind. In my view of what a new education system looks like, I would see to it in the long run that the state supplies every child with a home computer. And then there's something else which I call a grandmother. It could be a grandfather, and it's a new kind of a teacher. And so there's those jobs. But if you keep somebody in school, you're not postponing it. And let me give you the calculation. It goes like this. Assume a 50-year working life. Now, actually, it's less than that, but 50 years illustrate the point. Each year that you keep a generation in, you're keeping them off the labor market. All right, that's 2% of your workforce. So if you kept them in for 3 years, you'd have 6% of your workforce. If that was successful in Australia, you'd have a desperate labor shortage. New Zealand, actually, similar figures. You got 6%, right? I mean, you create a desperate labor shortage. We must keep in mind, historically, that's exactly what we've been doing. As the Industrial Revolution progressed and we became more and more productive, one of both the benefits and necessities of that increasingly technological revolution. I mean, 150 years ago, the idea that everybody should learn how to read and write seemed nonsense. Right? So one of both the benefits and the necessities was to keep children in school longer and longer. And that's how we have gotten rid of some of the excess labor that was produced by the increasing productivity of the machinery. Right? Now we're in a similar, parallel situation. So keeping people in the education system, for each year you keep them in, that's 2% of your labor force, and that can be very significant. Now, getting back to the other question, if we create a good education system, and any of you, I don't know what the term is in this country. In Britain, we call it's used ESN, educationally subnormal children. If you've watched ESN kids at a computer, it is heartwarming, because firstly, and very often, if nobody watches them, because they don't be shown up how dumb they are. And they know that the computer will never tell it took them 10 times what the average child does in 4 or 5. But they've got the motivation and they learn. Most of what you describe is real enough. I think it's roughly right. And in Britain, it is creaking a lot. I don't know how it is here. The total demoralization, or not total, but the serious demoralization of the British secondary system is because it is divided up roughly along the line, where there's 20% that is being groomed for university and other tertiary education, and 75% being churned out as industrial fodder for industries that no longer exist. And it's a disaster. But it is cultural, it is not biological. The late Chris Evans, who was a psychologist, who wrote The Mighty Micro, always said, we shouldn't compare intelligence in terms of IQ, in terms of each other. We should compare intelligence in absolute terms. And what he meant by that is you begin at 0 intelligence, that's a rock. You begin with a lump of clay. That's 0 intelligence, right? Then you work yourself up to an amoeba that knows enough to get away when it's too hot and goes after something that tastes good, whatever amoeba does, right? And then you go up, to starfish, and you work your way up to fish and fowl and so forth. Now we know that chimps, when we get smart enough to learn how to communicate with them, can be taught the rudiments of logic without any difficulty. We know that chimps can make up new words when confronted with new objects. That's our closest relative, and we're way beyond that. Excluding brain-damaged children or metabolically damaged children, there is no question in my mind that we can move the whole lot up through the system effectively as we spend more money and more time, and something which I don't think I've said here today, but education is going to be the #1 employer in the future. Early in the next century, it'll be the #1 employer, and education will absorb a greater share of the gross national product than any other single economic activity. And a lot of these things which worry us now will fall into place as we move along.
Mike Davis of chartered accounting firm Hungerford's. When this industrial revolution began in the early years of last century, much of what you've said today was then being said, that the machines would put us out of work, there'd be the breakdown of the family. History tells us that didn't happen. What's different now, or is there something missing in the equation that you haven't considered?
I think you have to look again at history. People were put out of work by the machines and died. Let me be specific. Bradford, my new hometown in Yorkshire, around 1830, the mill owners went to steam, and about 10,000 handloom weavers in that area were reduced to pauperism. A few managed to get into the mills because they had mechanical background, but the vast majority survived only because they had a lot of children. And ironically, whereas they couldn't get the jobs, the children and sometimes the women could get the jobs, and they just eked out an existence. In Bradford itself, around 1830 now, infant mortality was 330 per thousand in the inner wards. Life expectancy at birth was 18.7 years. And if you looked at the whole thing crassly, what was happening is the countryside was providing labor. Sometimes there was strong Irish immigration later on, was being denuded of people which went into the cities where they died. By far more people died in Bradford than were born, yet Bradford grew at 5% per year for about, I've forgotten, 30, 40 years. And it is wrong to say that not millions of jobs were lost as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and that people suffered terribly. It's that it's sort of gotten buried under the carpet, and I would not like us to repeat that mistake a second time. By the way, we are not in the same position now. It's not as bad, and the reason we haven't had with a 12%, 15% unemployment rate, that serious a problem in many Western countries is because we've got a financial support. The people don't starve to death. They may be miserable, but they don't starve to death, and it's a big difference. So they're not as desperate.
Jan Landberg, Aspect Computing. You mentioned that you expected a lessening of global conflict and wars, and that would release a lot of people. And you also suggested that that could be taken up by helping the third countries. Why aren't we using our surplus people at the moment for those purposes? And do you really think that the financial possibilities would be available for using the people for the third world countries?
There will be, or there are already, they exist now, three major reasons for helping third world countries. They are what I call the moral, the imperative, and the commercial. Now, the moral reason is, of course, that it's wrong that in some parts of the world the diet of the people is so rich that arterial sclerosis and other degenerative diseases are part. That's clearly wrong. And I'm of the belief that good morality, there's nothing so practical as good morals. The imperative reason is it is only a matter of time before we will have ayatollahs with a trigger on their finger on a nuclear trigger. The so-called nth country problem is being exacerbated by the development of civilian nuclear energy, which incidentally is going to look like a big white elephant 10 years from now, because one of the things that's happening around the world, roughly in 1983, roughly $1 billion US dollars is being spent on solar energy development in the area of photovoltaic cells. It is a technology very close to the chip technology. I don't know when the breakthrough happens, but when it does, we're going to see the same kind of, Texas Instrument published the data that every time they doubled production, they cut 28% of the cost. And we all have had the experience of the cost of per unit of information processed, the cost dropped roughly by an order of magnitude every 5 years. Now, I don't know if this curve will be as steep as that for the photovoltaics, but it will be a steep curve, and we will have a decline in price to the point not only will it be competitive with oil, it would have been already 3 or 4 years from now if the price of oil had continued to go up. Because it's stabilized and in fact is coming down in real terms, both the target of meeting it and the motivation for the research has declined. So the thing is slowing up a bit. But nuclear energy, and this was a slight diversion, nuclear energy is spreading around the world. Those countries that pick up the civilian technology will, in many instances, develop nuclear weapons, and I'm very pessimistic on this score. I think around the turn of the century, there's a very great likelihood that we will see a weapon, perhaps a few, dropped in anger. It will not involve the West. It will not involve the Soviet Union. It will not involve China. It is likely to be India, Pakistan, Libya, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Upper Volta, Shad, or I don't know what it is. It's going to be say Argentina, Chile. It's going to be in that part of the world. Now, it's going to be important to us to create the kind of economic climate which leads to political stability, which will keep people, if they do achieve a nuclear capability, from engaging in adventures. So that's the imperative reason. And the commercial reason is simply this. There's a couple of billion people out there who are not only starving, but who aren't buying. Now, if you make them wealthy, they will buy your products, and it is in everybody's interest to get them moving. And what I like to think is we will manage things better than we are at the moment. At the moment, we're just finishing up the mechanical era, as I call it, and it's going to take us a while to recognize and put all the pieces together. It's starting to happen, and I think we're going to reevaluate. The kind of thing of simply sending aid is not on. I disagree very strongly with the approach, the more I look at it, hear about it with the Brandt report. What I think is we have to engage in specific sort of people-to-people projects, beginning, I would say, in many instances, with education. What they lack desperately in the third world is managerial know-how. They often have the resources, they don't know how to harness them. But that in many ways is true all around the world, including for Australian companies.
Richard Buckdale, Applied Mathematics Department, Sydney Uni. There's two things I'd like to raise. One is that you suggested that people should stay at school for a longer period and have a higher education. That's all very well, but there's one big problem, and that is that vast sections of the working class are unable to do this because they simply cannot afford to do it. When you haven't enough money really to live very satisfactorily, and your children need to go to work in order that you can have extra breadwinners in order to get enough money in to manage the household, well, the situation of just going on for higher education just doesn't appear. However competent the particular student may be, and however brilliant they may be, in very many cases they just simply are unable to do so. So that's one aspect I wish to raise. Second thing is that I dispute to some extent part of the scenario you sort of put forward regarding the third world countries, specifically with regard to the reason for wars in the third world countries. I agree with some of the points you raised there, but I think that if you have a look at quite a few of the wars that have occurred in the last decade or 2 decades, you will see that many of these have arisen because of conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, I could mention, for example, in the Middle East, where both the Arab countries and Israel are being backed in some cases by both countries. That is to say, the United States backs both countries, so does the Soviet Union in different ways. The Soviet Union sends Jews to Israel that become part of the military machine there. The United States pours money into both Arab countries and into Israel. In both cases, they do this in order to gain a certain amount of power, a certain sphere of influence in that region. And I would give you many other examples. You could take Africa, or you could take, for example, Chile, where it's quite well documented what the CIA did. And this documentation doesn't come from sort of weirdos guessing. It comes from people that were CIA operatives that actually spoke out and stated what they were doing in these countries. It's not a question, it's a statement. What I'm saying is that I'm disputing with you the reasons for the wars in these third world countries. What I'm saying is that the reason for the bulk of these wars in the third world countries is because the United States and the Soviet Union are playing out a fight to get a sphere of influence in various regions. That's what happened in Vietnam, and that's what happened in the various other countries. That's the second point I'd like to raise.
I would certainly agree with you that big power involvement exacerbates the situation. But I can't help noticing in Vietnam, as soon as the United States pulled out, the fight now shifted between Soviet influence and Chinese influence, and that you have, in fact, enormous hatreds in that part of the world. As somebody has once pointed out about war, the greatest hatred always seems to be reserved for the man in the next valley. And whereas there's no question of US and Soviet support and intervention and meddling, if you wish, in the Far East, I wish it were simple that if the US and the Soviet Union kept their hands off the Middle East, that the Jews and Arabs would all get together and live like good Christians or whatever. Well, look, I think we're not going to settle. It's a different point of view of the world. I feel that what you have in the third world is the following mess. Western medical technology got there before the Industrial Revolution, and it totally upset the ratio of resource to population. And we're going to see things get worse before they get better. And all the instabilities that you see is really a reflection of that sort of situation. Now, I'm not sure. I accept that there are many other viewpoints, and I just ask you to accept mine, not necessarily agree with it.
Alex Reid, University of Western Australia. I'd like to bring you back to your formula for solving our unemployment problem. The previous questioner listed a number of objections that one might have to your formula, and I can think of several others, such as that some people like being on the dole, that it would create a tremendous upheaval in our education system, and so on. But I don't find those arguments terribly persuasive, which makes me wonder why nobody around the world has accepted your formula.
The answer is I'm a few years ahead of everybody else. But not to be entirely facetious, look, it is nice, and one reason I took the job in Britain as Professor of Science and Society was I was being paid to think about things that most people aren't being paid to think about. And I felt it was my function to look initially at the interaction between science, technology, and society in a way that hadn't been looked at before. Now, only time will tell whether I'm right. And by the way, something I haven't said, it's interesting that with the exception of countries like Singapore and Japan, who understand quite well, I think, the way the world is drifting, the Australian government is the first Western government to indicate that they have an inkling of what it means to have moved into a post-industrial society and what to do about it. And people like me around the world are watching Australia to see if they win that race as well.
Michael Steinle from the Australian Road Research Board. Professor Stonier, during the main part of your talk, you said that if we gave you the chance later, you'd give some of your evidence for the democratization of the USSR. I'd be very interested to hear that, please.
First, let me begin by saying, any of you who are particularly interested in this area, write me and I'll send you a reprint of an article which I published in the spring issue of Political Quarterly. Now, the theoretical basis for this goes something like this. Both the physical communications infrastructure and the nature of the labor force changes as you move into an information economy, information society, post-industrial economy. And this makes it impractical to run things from the center, and it decays. Now, let me amplify that a bit. Physical communications technology, I feel, can be measured quantitatively in terms of per capita telephones, per capita television sets, radios, private automobiles, number of people flying in and out of the country, that sort of thing. Anything that moves people is a form of communication. I mean, it gets people to talk to each other. Anything that transmits information. Sometimes a leaky system like that, a system gets more and more sophisticated and leaky, and sometimes in a very surprising way. For example, the Shah of Iran had very tight control on radio, television, and the press, of course. What he'd overlooked, or what the CVAC overlooked, were tape recorders. The good Ayatollah's speech were going from mosque to mosque on tape recorders, because you all know how easy it is to duplicate tape. And he just overlooked it. And I understand a similar phenomenon in the Soviet Union. You see, a tape, it doesn't react to metal detectors. It's easily moved about. And what happened was, a lot of decadent bourgeois music got into Russia. And also some underground poetry and things like that. So that's the first thing. It gets leakier and leakier. And there's a certain kind of to me, significant figure, which is 200 telephones per 1,000. Now, the Soviet Union is only around 80, I think, and it won't reach the 200 if they keep going at the present rate until about the mid-90s. But I think there's more to it than that. Now, the second thing is, if you look at the nature of the workforce, if the workforce is predominantly peasants, and as is true in much of the Third World, it is not only easy to bully peasants, it's easy to mystify them. And in many ways, it is not surprising that an authoritarian regime exists. If you have factory workers, it gets more difficult, but not impossible. Factory workers will communicate with other workers within the factory, and that's why they form a very strong, potent political force. But they're still not communicating normally during their working hours with others. In order to communicate, you show up. You can be fairly easily identified as an organizer, right? But with information operatives, which is all of us, and I didn't talk about the shift to the information operative as a dominant form of labor as we move into post-industrial economy, the information operatives are always telephoning each other, writing each other memoranda, attending seminars and board meetings, coming to conferences, listening to boring lecturers, and all that sort of thing. Now, during the getting together, during this communication, they always discuss other things. I'm sure you're all aware, during the day today, during the week here, you're not just talking about computers. You meet, Joe, how have you been, and whatever. Now, what that means is you can't control the flow of information anymore. And by the way, with that 200 per 1,000, in Greece, one of the first things the colonels did was because they wanted to make Greece, a great modern state, and they encouraged Bell to form a very extensive network. And that 200 per 1,000 was reached in the early 70s, and somebody made a calculation that in order to monitor that system effectively would absorb the entire Greek labor force. Now, the Greeks are notoriously loquacious people, but I think, Anyway, the thing is, of course, that with the computers coming in, theoretically, you can control things better. And yet, at the same time, as you know, with the kids and the micros at home, it also gets easier and easier to louse up the system. And because if it's a system open listening in, it's a system you can get into, right? And it gets impossible to monitor. And there's something else. The information operatives do know what's going on. And what happens now is an authoritarian regime finds that an independent body of public opinion has emerged, what to do about it. Now, you either follow them, which means you've ceded authority, or you get repressive. That's the way the Marcos is in the Philippines. By the way, they're not ready to go into communicative era yet. But in the case of the Greek colonels, they discovered every time you get repressive, you alienate somebody else. Now, what I cannot tell is what's going to be the trigger. You see, in Greece, it was a confrontation with an external military power, Turkey. And it was interesting. I mean, here we were reading about they got the guys in jail and are torturing them, right? And a weekend goes by and they're gone. And no blood in the streets, no tanks, nothing. In fact, there's some very nice anecdote. I heard I had a Greek postdoctoral student who'd been there at the time. And, I think I won't tell you the anecdote. Anybody who wants can come up afterwards. So there's some lovely stories as to what went on during the change. But the trigger for Greece was the confrontation with external military power. The trigger for Portugal was a palace coup by young military officers out of Angola, Mozambique, a Vietnam-style no-win situation. And Spain, the old man died. Now, all of those three are possible for the Soviet Union. The trigger could be a confrontation with an external military power, and I think not us, but China. They could bumble into that. I don't think it's likely, but it's one possibility. Second possibility, we don't know what's going on in Afghanistan, but it's quite possible young military officers coming out of there. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. The most likely is, and we're seeing it, the old men are dying off, and Andropov is putting in already a new generation of managers. I don't expect Soviet Union to democratize under Andropov, but Andropov is no longer an ideologue. He's interested in getting the system to work, because it's not working. And he's setting the stage. But there could be other triggers. In Poland, the trigger was in Gdansk, the shipworkers' union. And that's a tough one, because you see, communists can kill priests and they can kill landlords, but killing workers, that's a tough one always. And so it would be the height of irony, you see, because we know there's strikes going on in the Soviet Union. By the way, another thing is, it's not realized, by 1982 already, last year, 10% of Soviet agricultural land was being used for private purposes. The land had been given, it's officially owned by the state, but it's used for private purposes. And 60% of the potatoes that you can buy on the open market come from those little allotments. So, and it was done with the best of reasons, you understand. The factory workers should help the country and produce their own food, right? Wonderful reason. So each factory gave its workers allotment, and they grew potatoes and cabbage or whatever, and everything out on the market, and there we are, into private enterprise. And so it's all getting frayed. I think it's a big hollow shell. But the height of irony would be if the trigger turns out to be a strike in Leningrad.
We have time, I think, for one short question and perhaps one short answer.
That's a problem.
I would have liked to just thrown in two things very shortly. One was the reduction of the working hours. I think the biggest stick this government I can remember getting out strongly and saying within 18, or the previous government here, within the last 18 months, was that they would very, very strongly reduce going to a 35-hour working week. They wouldn't even see that it was a consultative process, say, for an hour a week for the next 5 years to bring it down. And I wonder if that resistance is in other Western countries too. The other one is that many millions of dollars on educational software has gone down the drain because of poor management. I don't think it will be enough for the grandmother to look after the Encyclopedia Britannica on a set of laser discs and the child learn in the home. I think there's a human component to the present teaching that has been proved in many trials and experiments, my observation from things around the world, that is going to take some time for the present people softwaring to be able to incorporate into their software in a way that actually manages learning. I think in some way you need to know that it takes Fred 4 times as long to get through, not just to pick on him, but to help him make progress in the next stage and so on. So the management of the learning process, to me, is something that I can't see that has been really tackled in any way, and I'd be interested in your comment either on the shortened working hours or the management of education.
You know, I think I'm going to let the second question go, because I think that's going to get us into, I can't give a short answer on the management of the learning process, because it involves, I think, a whole question of education philosophy, but I will address myself to that on Friday. But the thing that, on a shorter working week, look, let's face it, Western governments are, as far as economic doctrines are concerned, a mess. The center is dominated by Keynesian doctrines which emerged 60 years ago. The left is dominated by doctrines that emerged 100 years ago. The right is dominated by doctrines that emerged 200 years ago. And it's a hell of a way to run a country.
Professor Stonier, thank you very much for that very illuminating talk. I think it's now the 4th or maybe 5th time I've heard Tom, and there's always a bit of the old and a bit of the new, and it's it's invigorating each time. Just before we finish, on behalf of the Australian Computer Society, I'd like to present Tom with this small stone. That's Estonia. It's not even small, actually. I don't know how an overseas speaker is going to get it home, but I'd like to present him with this small gift in appreciation. Thank you very much. Perhaps I could just remind you that Tom Stonier is speaking on Friday at the School Symposium, and his topic is an education-based one, so I think you should find that interesting. Here, I believe, is there someone who knows? Details can be obtained from the registration area in any case. 10 ACC delegates are invited to attend it.
Yes, he didn't bring that up, did he?
Software. So I had a couple. Oh, one was asked.
Oh, right.
The other one was, what do we do so we keep it?
All right.
He's keeping his hand on very closely. He's not bad, is he?
Oh, it wasn't too bad. He knows his work.
If Doug Allen is in the room, could he come to the front, please? Doug Allen? Sandra Small? Never.